So the assumption is I see happening, playing out a lot when, especially around linguistics, around words. So when you use a word like it's done, and then a person says, okay, great. And then one person's interpretation of the word done is different than the other. But now, when I see what you've done and it's not done in the way that I expected, I blame you. And that would be an example of where I would say, okay, it's not that the person didn't do it, it's that you had an assumption of what it was and you didn't check.
Okay, Andy, so now we're on chapter 7, which is about assumptions. And we all know that, people that go back into the 80s know that assume is to make an ass out of you and me.
Yeah.
How do you take this point of assumption and bring it back into connection?
Yeah. Assumptions for me, again, going back to the landmines. So expectations are what I say, what I bring in from my history, from my past, my societal beliefs, what I think is good and bad, and so on. Where an assumption is in this moment, I'll use the meaning that I've given it in order to make assumptions about what you're not doing right or what you're doing right or wrong. So for me, assumptions are really important to track because I've often seen people blame others when they don't fulfill the assumptions that they've made.
Okay. Now, how do you see the distinction between assumptions and expectations from the last chapter?
Yeah. So when I mentioned earlier, so when I have an expectation, I often carry it with me into the relationship. It's some part of, like I said earlier, we're going to get married at 20, we're going to have kids at 24, we're going to have a house at 30, right? Whatever the expectations are of where I believe I'm going to be, and then everything is sort of a goal orientation to get there. Now, I don't want to say that's bad, but I want to say if it's unconscious and you blame your partner, that's when you lose connection. And that's what I don't want to ever do when I'm in a relationship. I don't want to lose connection. So the assumption is I see happening, playing out a lot when, especially around linguistics, around words. So when you use a word like it's done, and then a person says, okay, great. And then one person's interpretation of the word done is different than the other. But now, when I see what you've done and it's not done in the way that I expected, I blame you. And that would be an example of where I would say, okay, it's not that the person didn't do it, it's that you had an assumption of what it was and you didn't check. And I see that happen all the time.
Well, let me ask you about relationships and connection and assumptions. Like it kind of seems that if I always have to check all of my assumptions, because we shortcut everything.
Yeah.
Right? Assumptions are there because we make shortcuts to make it easier to just live our life.
Yeah.
Where is it that, golly, I have to check all these darn assumptions? There's 50 million of it. Where do you start? Where do you stop? How do you know when it's too much? When you want to work on a relationship?
So 90% of the things I assume, and I don't care about the outcome. I know I've made an assumption, so I don't blame another person otherwise, but they're not important enough for me to check. So it's that 10% where if it doesn't happen in the way that I would need, it would really be a problem for me. That's when I spend the time.
So basically where it's you're focusing on the ones that cause the biggest problems.
Yes.
So how do you identify those?
Well, you identify with your own pain. How painful would it be for me if this wasn't done, or if there was a problem that wasn't solved, or like that would be where I double check. Or there's also times, let's say I'm doing it now more from a standpoint of trying to get to an outcome, right? But on the other side, there's a way of like looking at assumptions and then creating greater connection. And that would look something like this. If I was talking to somebody and they said, I'm not feeling too well, the first question I'd say, well, too? So I'd ask them to deepen whatever it is they were saying. I wouldn't make any assumption of what too meant. Mm-hmm. I wish it was going better. How do you mean better? And by like not assuming what I know better would be, I give the other person an opportunity to deepen the awareness of what's going on inside of themselves and obviously create more connection through that. Because a lot of times people use language sloppily and then they haven't given much meaning to those words. They just throw them away, and 90% of the people never ask them what they mean. And it's confusing for people to really be asked a question where the other really wants to know and understand what they're saying. It can throw them back on their heels a bit, like, hold on, someone's really interested? I'm used to people just speaking and then waiting for me to stop so they could start. So that's the.
So let me like for example, you know, I go to a meeting for like a Chamber of Commerce meeting or something like that, and I meet somebody, and we have an interesting discussion, and I suggest, hey, we should meet over a coffee and talk about this, and they say, yeah, let's meet over a coffee, and then I contact them to follow up and meet over a coffee, and they never respond.
Yeah.
I made the assumption that the person saying they wanted to have a coffee
meant that they really wanted to have a coffee.
And
yes.
in fact, they were just kind of like satisfying me to maybe get rid of me.
Yeah.
Is that something I should be worried about, those types of assumptions? Should I look into those types of assumptions, or should I just go?
What's funny when you say look into them, again, it would be one of those things. This whole section is called connection killers. And part of it is, if I'm unaware of the assumption, I might blame the other person and not realize it's a cultural norm.
Right.
To say, hey, let's just have a coffee. And then you don't judge them, you don't judge yourself. It's just, oh, wow, I made the assumption that they wanted to meet me. And that's sort of the kind of the loving embrace of what is, without needing to blame anyone, yourself or the other. And that's why it's, for me, always about heightening self-awareness and not about what should I do. Well, I think what you do is you're so aware, you're like, I guess next time someone says that, I'll ask a question like, when you say that, are you asking me because you really want to have a coffee? And then look at how the dynamic changes. They might say, yeah, and then, yeah, but that would be a freedom you'd give yourself because you wouldn't be constrained by the assumption that they actually do want to have a coffee with you. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, while you were saying that, I was thinking, you know what I could have done is go, hey, look, I'm free next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Would you like to get a coffee? And they go, well, let me check my schedule
Yeah.
and get back to you. And they don't, then you know, right?
Yeah,
It's
you would
like
see their reaction like, hey, you know.
Yeah, you're pushing a little bit too much. That's not exactly what I meant.
Yeah, that would be it.
So for this exercise in this chapter, what do you hope people draw out of it that can move them forward towards accomplishing stronger and better connections?
So what I wanted for people to do something really simple and just look at words. So words that might have values, like I said a moment ago, like it's not going too well. What do you mean too? She's having difficulties. What difficulties? So in a way, I've seen that connection is really beautiful when people use just the simplest of questions to allow people to share more, because it's very rare that people really engage people any deeper than the superficial level. And so I see that the assumptions assuming that we know what another person means by the words they use, obviously has to be done because we have to interact and have some common language, but it also limits the depth of which we can go because we don't ask questions which allow us to get closer and understand the other better. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.